That's good. Welcome to our Colloquium event that is held on Monday today instead of Wednesday. And it seems like quite a few undergrad students are here, which is awesome because we do this as a department all the time, and you guys are absolutely welcome to come to these events and you get a little bit more exposure to some in-depth real research. And I know in my class, quite a few of you used an article by Dr. Brody for an assignment, so now you can see there's like a human behind that article, which is great. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Nick Brody, who is an assistant professor in communication studies at our neighboring university, the University of Puget Sound. So he kindly strolled up here to give a talk. Dr. Brody received his MA at Arizona State and then did his PhD in comm studies at UT Austin. And so he is one of the comm scholars of the Southwest powerhouses. Came up here in 2013, right? And so finished your PhD in 2012, right?
2013.
2013, oh wow.
Yeah, really quick transition.
Yeah, really quick transition. So Dr. Brody has, his older work is often about mediated romantic relationships and is really, really interesting work, and now is transitioning into doing more work on cyberbullying, harassment, nefarious stuff online, and so still looking at generally with an interpersonal lens, so that's really interesting. And so I know at least one study has been published from this data. It was in human behavior?
Monographs.
Oh, comm monographs, that was late last year. So this is a really interesting line of research and absolutely important practical questions, but also theoretical questions. So, and what I really like about this particular work is it's focusing on not just, cyberbullying and harassment happens, but under what circumstances are people actually doing something about it? So it's a really, really important twist. So with that, I would like us to welcome Dr. Brody.
Thank you, Katie, for the very kind introduction. This all started when I was giving a presentation on one of the studies that I'll be talking about today during the National Communication Association annual conference, and it was at this 8 a.m. panel on the very last day of the conference on a Sunday morning. So I figured if Katie was willing to come to this, panel 8 a.m. last day of the conference, I was more than happy to come up here and give a talk, and I really appreciate the invite to speak with all of you here today. Broadly, as Katie mentioned, my research considers the intersection of interpersonal communication and communication technology, and this has taken me in several different directions. So early in my research program, and still a few studies currently, I work with the team that looks at social networking site use in romantic relationships, particularly during the relational disillusion and the breakup process. In some of my other work, I've looked at mobile communication, mediated communication and relational maintenance, and in particular language use in mobile communication and how that affects and is affected by our romantic relationships. And then my main focus recently has been looking at online harassment and cyberbullying, and that's the research that I'm going to share with you today. So I'm going to share a series of studies, 3 studies in particular, that focus on a few things. The first, I'm going to talk about a couple studies that look at the role of bystanders in cyberbullying incidents. So what predicts whether or not a bystander to an online harassment episode or a cyberbullying incident might actually intervene to help a victim. I'm also going to talk a little bit about some early work that I've done that looks at differences in language use in accounts of cyberbullying incidents. In other words, when people describe cyberbullying incidents that they've observed, can we extract meaning from the language that they use in those accounts? And then finally, I'm going to talk about some more descriptive work that I've done recently that looks at what do these cyberbullying incidents actually look like? So despite a lot of the public conversation, a lot of the research that has looked into cyberbullying recently, we know surprisingly little from a research perspective about what cyberbullying actually entails, particularly in social networking site contexts. So I'll be stepping through and talking about each of those different studies, and I know that we'll have time for questions at the end, but if there's anything that I can clarify as I move through the presentation, feel free to stop me, and I'm happy to chat about it. All right. So cyberbullying, there are a variety of definitional controversies relating to cyberbullying, and we're not going to dig into that debate right now. So for the purposes of my presentation today, we're just going to call cyberbullying bullying behavior that occurs via electronic or digital media. And it really is starting to receive quite a bit more research attention. It's receiving a lot of attention in the popular press. When I talk to my students about cyberbullying, almost all of my students can offer up examples of instances where they've either witnessed cyberbullying or even been a victim of cyberbullying. Just by a show of hands, how many of you have witnessed cyberbullying occurring in some context, any context? Just a show of hands. Okay. So I think that's almost everybody here in the room. Where does it happen? When you've witnessed cyberbullying, where, in what context is this cyberbullying occurring? Anyone want to share? Yeah. Twitter, okay. Facebook, absolutely. YouTube, for sure. The YouTube comments notoriously rife with online harassment, right? Any other places where we see cyberbullying occurring? No. Text messaging, absolutely. So private messaging platforms as well. So cyberbullying occurs across all of these platforms, and the media has started to pay attention to this phenomenon as well. So my work on cyberbullying took place shortly after the Tyler Clementi situation happened at Rutgers. Does anyone, show of hands, anyone remember the Tyler Clementi incident? So really briefly, Tyler Clementi was a student at Rutgers, and his roommate filmed him having sexual relations with another man. And he didn't want to share that information with the public. And this incident was witnessed by, at least that we know of, dozens of other people. And Tyler eventually ended up committing suicide. So we know that cyberbullying and incidents like this can have drastic consequences. And the one thing that I think got my attention about the Tyler Clementi situation in particular was that there were witnesses to this incident. And those witnesses didn't do anything. Those witnesses didn't offer Tyler social support. Those witnesses didn't step in to stop Tyler's roommate from broadcasting this video live. And as I started to look at the research into cyberbullying, I noticed that the bystander has received scant attention in bullying research. There's some research that has looked at the bystander in traditional bullying episodes. Very little research, there's more coming out recently, that looks at the bystander in cyberbullying incidents. Yet we know that upwards of 85% of bullying incidents, and this is both online and offline incidents, occur in the presence of others. These are not incidents that occur in private where nobody knows that this is happening. And when we think about the ways that these incidents unfold online, whether they're on Twitter or whether they're on Facebook, whether they're in the YouTube comment section, given the quantity of social connections that we have in the online world, it's possible in many instances that hundreds, if not thousands, in some extreme cases, millions of people can be bystanders to a single cyberbullying incident. Okay? But like I mentioned before, we know very little about why often these bystanders choose not to intervene. What we do know, at least in research from traditional bullying, so offline bullying, that when a bystander does take action, that it can have drastically positive effects on the victim. Intervention can drastically attenuate the negative consequences of bullying. So with all of this in mind, I decided to undertake a couple of research projects that got at some of my central questions, which were, what predicts whether or not a bystander intervenes during a cyberbullying incident? And my research, at least initially, was framed using previous theoretical work and research on the bystander effect. Is anyone familiar with the bystander effect? Maybe from comm classes or from social psychology classes, perhaps. Okay, the idea of the bystander effect is that when an emergency situation is occurring, and there are bystanders to that incident, as the number of bystanders to that incident increases, the likelihood of an individual witness or bystander of intervening to stop the emergency or to help during the emergency goes down. So we feel less personal responsibility to take action because we assume with all of these dozens or in some cases hundreds of other witnesses, somebody else is going to take care of it. Somebody else is going to step in and help. The famous historical example of this happening is the Kitty Genovese case in New York City. And Kitty Genovese was a woman who was sexually assaulted in an alley, and apparently, although some recent historical work has quibbled with the details of the Kitty Genovese case, apparently dozens of people in the surrounding apartment buildings heard her being sexually assaulted. Nobody did anything. Nobody did anything to help. So researchers then took this example and conducted a series of experiments in lab settings mostly that showed as the number of witnesses to these types of incidents increases, the likelihood of one bystander intervening goes down. And this research in the last 15 years or so has been extended into the online world as well. So in one study, we know we found, not me, but the researchers who conducted this study found that message board participants were more likely to respond to requests for help when there were fewer active online posters on the message board at a given time. So when there was a signal indicating that there were very few posters on an online message board, they were more likely to help than when it seemed like there were many other posters on the message board. Similarly, in another study, researchers examined email requests for help. And when an email request for help indicated that multiple participants were contacted, so when the to field was filled with other recipients for this request of help, the recipients of that email were less likely to actually offer that help than if the email was just sent to one or two people. Okay? So this provides support for this idea that even in online environments, the number of other bystanders that are present matters and affects our own intervention behavior. So that's the first factor that I wanted to look at and wanted to consider. And I'll come back to what the specific predictions are in just a second. The other factor was anonymity. But in this case, I wasn't really as concerned with anonymity in the traditional sense. So in other words, I wasn't concerned with anonymity such as your online identity being disassociated from your offline identity. Because, as you'll see in a second, I was examining social networking sites. And social networking sites, our online identities are often closely linked with our offline identities. There are some exceptions, obviously. But what I noticed when examining some of the traditional work into the bystander effect was that a few studies found that when a victim in these studies was aware that a bystander was present, and the bystander knew that the victim was aware that they were present, the bystander reacted more quickly to help the victim than when neither the victim nor the bystander were aware. And I thought about how these studies could be extended into the online world, into the social networking site world. And although individuals on social networking sites often know each other, so they're not anonymous in that traditional sense, if we define anonymity as this sense of whether or not bystanders believe themselves to be visible, in other words, if a bystander to an online bullying incident feels like the victim knows that they're there, knows that they're online, knows that they're witnessing this incident, they should be more likely to intervene. Okay? So we labeled this visual anonymity. And in addition, there's a wide array of research that shows that anonymity more generally allows us to eschew normal social norms associated with helping. So when we feel anonymous, we feel less pressure to help others. The final factor that I expected to affect bystander behavior was, not too surprisingly, relationships. Okay? As I mentioned before, and as you are all aware, in online social networking sites, we're often connected with people whom we're also friends with offline. Okay? And even though this seems pretty obvious, this is a relatively new idea in the mediated communication research world. Relationship development largely now begins offline and then migrates online. So these cyberbullying incidents were occurring in the presence of other people that we might consider to be very close friends, that we might consider to be family members, that we might consider to be romantic partners. And given that relational closeness and friendship predicted bystander behavior in traditional cyberbullying incidents and some other research, I expected that relationships would matter in online bullying as well. All right. So I'm going to talk about some of the hypotheses based on the literature that I reviewed here. So first, you might expect that as the number of bystanders to a cyberbullying incident goes up, the red arrows here essentially indicate negative associations, negative correlations. So you might expect as the number of bystanders goes up, active defending behavior, which is behavior in which a bystander takes direct action to help a victim, that behavior might decrease. Similarly, social support behaviors such as providing emotional support to a victim, esteem support, so building up the victim, and network support such as providing resources relating to people in your social network, that type of behavior might go down as the number of bystanders goes up. Similarly, or contrarily, as the number of bystanders goes up, the likelihood of any single bystander to stand by and passively observe the incident would go up. Okay, so that's the green arrow there. Next, visual anonymity. This is that idea I was talking about before where we feel like, as a bystander, other people don't know we're online. So the closest example I can provide you of this is, let's say you're on Instagram or you're on Facebook, and you're just scrolling through your feed passively, okay? You're not logged into chat or anything like that, and you see a cyberbullying incident occur. Nobody knows that you're witnessing that incident. There's not a read receipt on your viewing of a post. If you haven't liked somebody else's post recently, maybe nothing has shown up on their feed on the right side, they don't know you're there, and you feel like you know that they don't know you're there. That's the sense of visual anonymity I'm getting at here. So visual anonymity is that sense of visual anonymity goes up. Active defending behavior and the types of social support I described before would probably go down. As visual anonymity goes up, the likelihood of us standing by to passively observe goes up as well. I also expected there to be an interaction effect. And I'll dig into this interaction effect a little bit later. But I expected that there would be a combined effect, essentially, of number of bystanders and visual anonymity, such that when there was an especially high number of bystanders and we felt especially visually anonymous, we would be even less likely to actively defend, even less likely to offer social support, and even more likely to stand by and passively observe the incident. All right. And this is based on some of the findings in the previous research that I described before. And then finally, relational closeness matters. As relational closeness between a bystander and the victim increases, active defending and social support behaviors increase, passive observing behaviors should decrease. All right, so my colleague and I conducted 2 studies to get at these hypotheses and to get at these predictions. I'm going to describe the first study, and then I'll describe the second study right after that. So in the first study, 265 participants at one of these large southwestern universities were provided with a definition of cyberbullying drawn from the literature. And we asked them to recall an incident from the previous year in which somebody they knew was targeted on Facebook. And in this case, we limited it to Facebook to control for all these other confounding variables relating to how these social networking sites work. But we expect that many of these findings could extrapolate into other social networking sites. And we asked them to describe the event in an open-ended format This was in an online survey, and then we asked several follow-up questions to make sure that they were as accurately as possible recalling the event. We measured a variety of things. I won't go into too much detail as to how we measured these, but the average scores on each of these items, as well as the standard deviation, and then the Cronbach's reliability are listed here in parentheses. We asked them to recall the number of bystanders, and that was in line with previous bystander intervention work in the offline world. So we used a similar measure for that. We created a measure for visual anonymity. So we asked participants to recall whether they felt the other people, including the victim, were aware of them, knew that they were there, recognized their presence, and could see that they were online. All right. We used a pre-established closeness scale to get at closeness with the victim. And then we used some measures from previous research into cyberbullying to get at active defending behavior and passive observing behavior. And then we used some measures from the interpersonal literature on social support to get at emotional esteem and network support. We also had a couple of control variables. So we asked participants to recall, or to who were bystanders to these incidents, we asked them to assess how hurtful they thought the incident was. And we also asked them about their own history of cyberbullying, whether they had been victims or perpetrators in the past, because we expected that that might affect their bystander behavior as well. And we controlled for those variables. So what did we actually find? And for those of you stats heads in the room, we actually did a series of regressions for each of the DVs separately, but for ease of presentation here, I'm focusing on the IVs just so I could show it in the same way that I presented the hypotheses. So for the first set of hypotheses, we indeed found that as participants reported a higher number of bystanders, they were less likely to actively defend the victim. They were more likely to passively observe the incident. We did not find a relationship between the number of bystanders and social support behavior, with the exception of network support. So we had a surprising finding where a number of bystanders went up, network support went up as well. Okay, and I'll talk about why that might be in a little bit. Visual anonymity, so this sense of feeling like other people know that you're there in that online environment. As visual anonymity increased, consistent with our hypotheses, active defending behavior went down, all three types of social support behavior went down, and passive observing behavior increased. And similarly for relational closeness, so the closeness that the bystander felt with the victim, as closeness went up, active defending behavior went up, passive observing behavior went down, and all three types of social support went up. So this was the first study, and obviously there are some shortcomings to this study. It was a recall study, so participants were recalling an incident that had happened in the previous year, and there's some challenges to doing that type of research. So in order to triangulate our results, we conducted a second study to get at the same hypotheses, but in this study, we used a variety of cyberbullying scenarios. So all the participants read the same scenarios, and we manipulated each of the independent variables so we could have a more tightly controlled study and experiment to get at some of these same questions. So I'm going to talk about those results as well. And I forgot to mention, we did not find support for the interaction effect between number of bystanders and visual anonymity, and I'll talk about why when I explain some of the findings from the second study here in a second. So in the second study, my colleague and I created cyberbullying vignettes. So we took the open-ended data from study one, and in a process that I'll describe down the road when I talk about some of the other research, we created a series of scenarios, and we did a pilot study where we asked some participants to assess how realistic these scenarios seemed to be. And we chose the most the scenario that was rated the most realistic cyberbullying scenario. And then we created a variety of conditions, which I'll show you here in a second. So we manipulated closeness with the victim, we manipulated number of bystanders, we manipulated visual anonymity. We essentially had a 2x2x2 design. So we had 8 different scenarios, and we set it up so that if the participant was a male, they read a scenario where the victim was a male, similar for females. Okay. So to set up the number of bystanders variable, we did it based on how many Facebook friends the victim had. So we took the mean from the first study and we subtracted one standard deviation and we added one standard deviation. So for low number of friends, it would be 170 friends, and for high, it would be 1,900 friends. For closeness, we just changed the terms describing the friend as a good friend or as an acquaintance. And for visual anonymity, we operationalized that as whether or not the participant was logged on to chat on Facebook and therefore visible to the victim and or the perpetrator. Okay. We used the same measures to get at active defending, social support, and passive observing that we used in the previous study, and we had the same control variables as well, degree of hurt and previous cyberbullying experience. Yeah, Kate.
So in this scenario, they also were friends on Facebook with the perpetrator.
In this scenario, well, I'll show you the scenario in a second. So, yeah. Okay. And we asked awareness check and manipulation check items, so we wanted to make sure participants weren't aware of this idea of the bystander effect, and there were a couple that were, so they were removed from the study. And we also did a manipulation check to ensure that each of these manipulations with the independent variables indeed resulted in participants feeling like there were more bystanders, feeling like they were closer to the victim, and feeling like they were more or less visually anonymous, and each of those manipulation checks worked out. So here's the example that we had for the male participants, and this is high number of bystanders, high visual or low visual anonymity, and the high number of bystanders, high relational closeness, and low visual anonymity. So you log into your Facebook account, you notice that your good friend Steve had his profile hacked. Someone hacked into his profile and posted embarrassing, inappropriate pictures and a pretty mean status update. You look down at the chat box and notice that you are logged into chat and Steve is online. Steve has only about 170 Facebook friends, so it's not likely many other people have noticed the status update and pictures. So that phrasing to kind of get at the fact that there might not have been too many other people there. Okay. Here it is for our female participants. We just use the name Jane. Here you can see low closeness, acquaintance. You are not logged into chat, and Jane is not online. So this is trying to get at this high sense of visual anonymity. And then finally, Jane has 1,900 Facebook friends, so it's likely that many other people have noticed the status update. So high number of bystanders here, as opposed to low on the previous slide. So here are our results. I'm only showing the significant findings that we had for ease of presentation. So for number of bystanders, we found significant differences for active defending behavior and passive observing behavior, similar to what we found in the first study. So when there were a high number of bystanders in the scenario, participants reported lower levels of active defending behavior and higher levels of passive observing behavior. Those are the blue bars there. For visual anonymity, so being logged in this scenario, being logged into chat or not, we found differences across all of the dependent variables. So when there was low visual anonymity, there were higher rates of active defending, all three types of social support, and higher levels or lower levels of passive observing. Okay. And then for closeness, similarly, we found significant differences for active defending and passive observing. So higher rates of active defending when reporting on a close friend or reading a scenario about a close friend versus reading a scenario about an acquaintance. Lower levels of passive observing and higher rates of emotional support for that close friend. For the active defending variable, we also had a three-way interaction, which essentially meant that in one of the scenarios, the difference really broke down to one scenario versus one other scenario. So of the 8 different scenarios that we had, the key differences were between essentially this cell right here and that cell right up there with the yellow bar at the top. So the yellow bar refers to the scenarios in which participants were close friends with the victim and there was a low number of bystanders. And then you can see on this side of the graph there was low visual anonymity. So when there was low visual anonymity in the scenario, when there was a low number of bystanders and when the victim was a close friend in the scenario, participants were especially likely to actively defend. Okay. Contrarily, when there was high visual anonymity, when the participants were just acquaintances with the victim, And when there were a high number of bystanders, participants were the least likely to intervene. So the significant differences were found between that condition and the top condition of the yellow bar. Okay. And that kind of got at the interaction effect that we predicted in the first study, but it was also qualified by the relationship with the victim. All right, so what are the implications of this finding? Well, there were a few implications of the findings here, and I'm going to talk about it in combination of both of the studies. First, our relationships are multimodal. We rarely think of our friends as either being online friends or offline friends anymore. These distinctions don't matter as much anymore. And when it comes to cyberbullying, this is important because the most consistent driver of our bystander behavior was our relationship with the victim, our closeness with the victim. And that matters when you think about the fact that social isolation exacerbates hurt. Individuals without these social networks of close connections, without these social networks of people who can help them, are already at risk for cyberbullying, other types of bullying behavior. And these results show that those individuals might not have the communities of individuals to draw upon for active defending or social support behavior either. The number of bystanders variable matters, so we were able to extend traditional work into the bystander effect in this study, but not as much as some of these other variables such as visual anonymity, and there was no effect really on social support. There was that positive relationship between number of bystanders and network support, and we thought that it's likely that bystanders who perceive there to be many other bystanders perceive a large number of potential outlets for network support. So they thought there were a lot of other bystanders there to help. They saw the fact that, well, maybe I can provide support by offering them opportunities to seek out other network members who can help them out. Visual anonymity mattered. Right? So visual anonymity affected intervention. Participants who perceived themselves as not visible to the victims were less likely to help, regardless of the number of other bystanders. There are also practical implications for this research. Practical implications are somewhat similar to what the original theorists and researchers who looked into the bystander effect put forward. They argued that the more that we're aware of the contextual factors that limit our bystander intervention, the more likely we are to take personal responsibility for taking action in those future incidents. So the more that we can train students, whether it's middle school students, high school students, college students, about these factors that might limit their intervention behavior, the more likely they are to intervene in the future when they see these types of incidents. Okay. The next study I want to quickly describe relates to language use in cyberbullying accounts. So I'm going to get into the methodology really quickly here in a second, but essentially in this study, we had participants talk about two different types of cyberbullying events. One in which they did intervene, and one in which they did not intervene. And we examined the language that they used in these two different incidents and compared them to each other to get at a variety of factors. There's a lot of research coming out now that shows that language can reflect a variety of underlying cognitive factors. Language can reflect our attentional focus. What are speakers and writers attuned to? What are they paying attention to? It can also get at our underlying emotional state and our underlying motivations for our behavior. So a lot of the words that matter in this research are what we call function words. And these are words that are outside of our conscious awareness, words like the pronouns that we use in our language, the adverbs that we use in our language. So we're not aware of how we're using these types of words, but they can reflect a variety of underlying factors. So for example, when speakers are using more first-person singular pronouns, more I words, there's a positive correlation between the frequency of using those types of words and depression. Okay? And a lot of this work has been conducted by James Pennebaker at the University of Texas and some of his students and colleagues as well. In one study, him and his colleagues examined poems by poets who either committed suicide eventually or poets who did not eventually commit suicide, and they compared their use of pronouns. And they found that in the poems by the poets who eventually committed suicide, there was a higher rate of first-person singular pronoun use. So more use of I words, higher proportion of I words, for example. Another example, an online example, in live journal posts following 9/11, there was a drop in first-person singular pronoun usage and an increase in first-person plural pronoun usage. Okay, so our pronouns and other types of function words can reflect how we're feeling and how we might choose to behave in the future. So few studies have examined this in the cyberbullying context, so I wanted to see if these words could also reflect how we might choose to behave or intervene in a cyberbullying incident. So I had a variety of predictions here. So in the incidents in which a participant was describing an incident in which they intervened to help, I expected that there would be higher use of pronouns than in incidents in which they decided not to help, in which they decided to passively stand by. And the reason for this is if we expect someone to take action, or if somebody took action, there might be more overall focus on the people in the situation. Okay? And if there's an overall use of higher overall use of pronouns associated with the focus on other people in the situation, that should bear out in the linguistic analysis. In addition, pronoun use relates to relationships and relates to our closeness with other people. So if we feel like we might be less likely to intervene, for example, because we feel visually anonymous, we might also be using fewer pronouns to describe the situation. So I expected in the intervention scenarios there'd be higher use of overall pronouns, first-person singular pronouns, first-person plural pronouns, and third-person pronouns such as they. All right. The next word use that I examined were number words and quantifier words. And these predictions came from the bystander effect. So if we know that as the number of bystanders goes up, intervention behavior goes down, we might expect in intervention accounts, we might see more words associated with numbers or quantifiers, thinking about how many other people are there. All right. And then just talked about the importance of relational closeness. So not surprisingly, we might expect there to be more words relating to social life, to friends, to family members in these intervention accounts than we might see in the non-intervention accounts. The final category relates to another component of the bystander effect, which I alluded to earlier, which is sense of personal responsibility. So when individuals feel a sense of personal responsibility, they are more likely to intervene to help. Cognitive mechanisms are words like cause and know and ought, think, consider, should, etc. And these words are indicative of more complex thought, more complex language. It includes subcategories such as insight words. So when you're using these types of words, it's likely that you're considering your role in this cyberbullying incident. And when you do so, when you're actually considering what role you might play in the cyberbullying incident, you should be more likely to take action. So I'll briefly describe the method so I can get to the last component of the presentation as well. Participants were provided with the definition of cyberbullying. Again, I said they recalled two different experiences, one in which they intervened in a cyberbullying incident, one in which they did not intervene, and across all participants that was counterbalanced. All right. What did we actually find? Oh, and we used, I used linguistic inquiry and word count, which is an automated linguistic analysis software program, which basically has all these different pre-validated groups of words, analyzes the text that you provide it, and essentially spits out quantitative data that you can use with these proportions of different types of words. Okay? And I used a series of paired samples t-tests to compare, and most of the hypotheses played out. So in the accounts in which somebody was describing an incident in which they intervened, they used more total pronouns, they used more first-person singular pronouns, they used more first-person plural pronouns, such as we, and they used more third-person pronouns, such as they. There were no differences between the quantifier and the numbers words. The numbers category was almost significant, so participants almost, it was just on the borderline, used more numbers words in the non-intervention incident than in the intervention incident. Participants who were using, participants in their account in which they intervened used more social words and more friend words than in the accounts in which they did not intervene. No differences for the family words, as you can see here. And they use more cognitive mechanisms, so those no and ought words, which might indicate they're thinking about their role in this cyberbullying incident, which might lead them to intervene and actually help. So what are the implications of this study? Well, the words that we use actually reflect our decisions to intervene. And one of the reasons I wanted to conduct this study was that all of my previous research into cyberbullying was asking for participants to report on their own either previous intervention behavior, self-report on it, or to talk about their intentions to intervene when reading a scenario. It can be tough to measure actual behaviors in bystander intervention and cyberbullying without getting archives of actual cyberbullying incident and analyzing those actual behaviors. So this is one way to get at what participants are actually doing without actually going out and measuring their behavior or assessing their behavior. And we know through previous language research that these incidents that words are often outside of our conscious control. So even when participants are asked to use more function words in a written document, for example, they can't do it, okay? So it can be really hard to strategically manipulate this type of word usage. All right. Because I'm running out of time, I want to make sure that I talk about some of the things in this final study. So I'm going to really quickly breeze through the methodology here. But essentially, we took the data for this final study from the first study I described, in which participants recalled cyberbullying incidents, and we coded them. So we wanted to know what types of cyberbullying incidents were actually occurring on Facebook amongst college students. So there's this. And we wanted to do this for a few reasons. First is this general idea that cyberbullying only happens in middle school and high school, but we know through descriptive data that it affects a large number of college students as well. Upwards of 40 to 50% in some surveys of college students experience cyberbullying. Many of them experience cyberbullying for the first time in college. Also, a lot of previous descriptive work on cyberbullying didn't look at what was actually happening in the incidents. Rather, it looked at whether the incident occurred via a cell phone or on a social networking site. So the typologies were based on the technology, not the actual content of these cyberbullying incidents. So we wanted to get at a little bit more, we wanted to get richer data as to what these cyberbullying incidents actually look like. So in the interest of time, I'm going to speed through the actual methodology, but I had some coders, and we came up with some categories of these different incidents, and we essentially ultimately split it into strategies and topics. So there were a variety of strategies that cyberbullies used, and there were a variety of topics that were covered. So strategies included things like public comments on Facebook. This could be a comment on a timeline or a wall. Private comment is a message sent via chat or private message. Photos, these might be posted publicly, but also sometimes photos were sent privately. Status updates, which the perpetrator posts a status talking about the victim. Ganging up, this could be several people ganging up to target a victim. A fake profile, so creating a fake Facebook account in a victim's name or in a variety of victims' names. Arguments were when public arguments, often between two people, kind of converted into being a cyberbullying incident. Burn books were creation, you kind of think of the Mean Girls example, right? The offline burn book. Burn books was that whole thing put online. So creating a fan page or a profile with the intent to say mean things about people or several people. Hacking or identity theft, that's the scenario that we used in our second study. So breaking into accounts, posting mean things, etc. Anonymous perpetrators were when anonymity was the key factor here. And specifically at the time of this study, there were these confessions pages. Does anyone remember confessions pages? I think that was a thing probably at UW too. It was pre-Yik Yak, where there were these confession pages on Facebook, and people could send in anonymous comments, and they'd be posted anonymously. Okay, so a lot of people reported those types of incidents. Those were put under anonymous perpetrator. And then videos. Topics. So every incident could have some combination of strategies and topics. Most of the topics related to relationships. So most of the topics were related to romantic relationships gone wrong, friendships gone wrong, usually because of breakups or infidelity in romantic relationships, usually because of some kind of friendship drama relating to friendships. Sexual activity could be things such as nude pictures or comments alluding to someone's sexual past or behavior. Skills and talents would be insults or critiques about somebody's competencies or abilities in some area, including art or schoolwork, etc. Personal appearance, insulting someone, calling them ugly, critiquing their outfits. Weight, being targeted both based on being overweight or underweight. Sexual orientation, often the use of derogatory names. Alcohol and drugs, so posting pictures or comments exposing somebody's alcohol or substance use publicly. Some of these incidents related to the victim being pregnant. A few arguments and comments relating to political leanings. Those might be peaking right now, right? So those might be contextual based on the time of the year or whether it's an election year or not. Some incidents relating to racism, racial epithets often used there as well. And then there are some incidents in which no topic was indicated or in which it couldn't be categorized. So finally, I'll close with a few examples just to show you what some of these look like. So for the first one of my friends was upset with another one of our friends. The person was upset because the other guy had not done a favor for him that he had promised to do. To get back at him, he found a very embarrassing picture of my friend and posted it as his profile picture. So this would be categorized strategy, photo, topic, friendship. My friend posted pictures on Facebook of a trip she just went on. A girl classmate of ours commented on every picture, critiquing what she looked like, saying she was ugly, and talked about that she didn't like the clothes she was wearing. So this would be public comments because it's public comments on the photo, and then categorized under the topic of personal appearance. A group of girls created a page called the Burn Book and basically just tore into certain girls for different reasons. The profile was private, so you had to be added as a friend. But if you were on it, they made sure to add you so you could see what hurtful things were being said about you. No particular topic here because a variety of people were targeted, so there were a variety of different topics, but the strategy was online Burn Book. And then finally, a girl cheated on her boyfriend while studying abroad, so the boyfriend broke into her Facebook account and told all of her friends what she did and called her some mean things. This would be romantic relationships and hacking. It could also be sexual activity, but we asked our coders to code the primary topic, usually what was reported first, which is why they might code that as romantic relationships. And in this case, the profile was hacked into. We found, in the interest of time, I'll skip over this, but we found surprisingly few sex differences. So there were no sex differences relating to strategy. Men and women were targeted similarly strategy-wise. The only differences we found were that female victims were more likely to be targeted using the sexual activity topic. Men were more frequently targeted using the sexual orientation or skills talent topics than women. So the implications of this study, I think I'm going to, first I'll talk about just the idea that this is a relational process. So cyberbullying is often studied in a fashion that is disconnected from the relationships that occur between the bystanders and the victims, or the victims and the perpetrators. But what I think these series of findings show is that our relationships matter. Our relationships can drive our behavior, whether it's providing support to the victim or seeking out support as a victim. Online social networking sorts are displays of our relationships. So it's not surprising that the harassment and the bullying that occurs in these contexts are often driven by our offline relationships with those people. Many of the topics reflected some of Dana Boyd's recent work on drama. So what we conceptualize as bullying, teens, especially middle school and high school students, they might really just see it as drama. And drama can occur between friends for any number of reasons. So we might categorize this as cyberbullying, but the actual people who are being victimized or the perpetrators might not see it as cyberbullying at all. So this is this kind of provides some directions for future research here. And I'm quickly running out of time. I want to make sure that there's time for questions here. So I want to thank you for having me here today. I've enjoyed talking to you, and I welcome any questions that you might have, suggestions, comments, etc. About this work. Thank you very much.
Maybe I'll start us off. Can you measure, but I'm curious how you actually operationalized active defending.
Yeah, so it's a continuous measure, and it comes from the participant role questionnaire that's often used in cyberbullying incident to get at what role an individual is playing in the bullying context. So it might be, I don't have all the items off the top of my head, but an item might be something like, I stepped in to stop the incident. I stepped in to take action to do something about the cyberbullying.
So like in frequency of you doing that? Or
yeah, so this was in this case, it was ranked on a 1 to 7 scale, strongly disagree to strongly agree as to whether or not you undertook that behavior during this incident.
Okay.
Yep. So we measured it, it was a Likert scale, and we measured it on a 1 to 7, and then
I
kind of
was
took the mean.
somehow, as you were talking about it, I was
Yeah.
like thinking like, called the police, notified, like
Right.
behaviors that would be very much categorical, but
Yeah.
that makes more sense.
It was purposefully broader because when you get really specific like that, somebody might say, no, I didn't call the police, but they did take action in some other way, and then we would kind of miss that behavior, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Great, thank you.
absolutely.
Can you go back to the, for study 2, there was a chart with the interactions on it.
Yeah.
That one. I wanted to think about it a little bit. So my question is, I'm trying to think about when other factors override close friendship. So
Yeah, so we're like on
you and I
the,
are close friends.
so right here, right, we see closeness here, just without any interaction effect, right?
Right,
But-
but I'm not
but then we go
interested in
here.
closeness alone. I'm just trying to think about where things turn out, and so.
So the
that
yellow
line
and the
is
purple.
close.
So the yellow and the purple, right? Those are when we're close friends with somebody. The yellow line, the purple line, that's always higher. We're always going to intervene more for our close friends than for our acquaintances. But it's an especially strong effect when those other factors, so it's kind of the combination of those 3 effects all together drove that 3-way interaction. And we didn't even see a 2-way interaction, right, between number of bystanders and closeness or visual anonymity and closeness. It was only when all 3 were combined. We really had to dig into it to
I'm just
figure out
trying
what's
to
going
think,
there.
so if we're close friends, but I know the victim there's a large number of bystanders.
When you're, there's a close friend, if you're,
And there's low visual, there's high visual anonymity.
you're still more, on a 1 to 7 scale, you're still more likely to intervene than not, but not not as high as if you were also identifiable in that condition.
Right, for sure.
It's important to point out that we didn't find this at all in the recall. So we tested the 3-way interaction in the recall study as well and didn't find it. And this is only for active defending. So we didn't find this 3-way interaction for passive observing or social support as well. It was just for active defending behavior.
So what matters most then? Like, what's the recipe, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, obviously, it's like, you're my close friend, you don't have anybody else out there, and you know I'm logged in, is not surprisingly, but like, in thinking about it from a practical standpoint, if we're trying to, educate young people,
Yeah.
Under these circumstances, this is when you should step in, and you might have the tendency not to, but counteract your tendency not to, and, help your friend. What's the relative way, like?
Well, I think you kind of have to consider all the results in unison, okay? Because this is, again, only one of the DVs in the second study. So I think when we look at the effect sizes across all the different studies, closeness was the most powerful across all these variables. So relationships matter. So then I think what becomes important is we're bombarded by information about our acquaintances on social networking sites every day, right? We see things about people who we haven't talked to face, maybe in years, all the time. So it can be very easy to become disconnected from their daily life and their condition, right? We see what's happening in their daily life, but it can be easy to become disconnected from the pain that they're experiencing in incidents like this, right, if they're just an acquaintance. So I think the important practical implication here is that we see these things happening to people we might not consider to be very close friends, maybe we should take action anyway. Maybe we should provide support anyway, even if it's somebody we haven't talked to since high school and we have nothing in common with them anymore. It can be important to step in anyway. And because of our lack of relationship with that person, we're going to be a lot less likely to do so unless we know that we should. Yeah.
In your data, was there anything on people saying that I did not know what to do or I did not know what the active stepping in should be?
So because of the way that we measured quantitatively people's intervention behavior, we didn't get a whole range of potential things that they might say or do instead of what we offered them. But that is a direction for future research because we were using the participant role questionnaire that was developed for offline intervention behavior. Nothing's been developed specifically scale-wise for online bullying behavior. So that's definitely on the docket for future work, including technological limitations, right? So let's say you see something happen on Snapchat that you might consider cyberbullying. What do you do about that, right? I know I barely know how to use Snapchat. If I saw something that related to cyberbullying on Snapchat and then it disappeared, I would have no idea what to do. So technological limitations can play a role there, but also whether or not the technology has built-in reporting mechanisms. We didn't build that into the study at all, partially because those mechanisms were just emerging when we conducted this data collection effort. So now on Facebook, you can report something that just had been introduced months before we collected this data. So I think that's really interesting as far as future research, and not just on Facebook, but across platforms. What are the built-in reporting mechanisms, and can that be predicted by these factors as well? Yeah.
In your first study, your scenario for male versus female speaking of word choice, seemed relatively different in the word choice used to describe the scenario. And I know you mentioned you did a manipulation check, and I'm assuming that's what directed that. But have you ever looked in the past at keeping both sexes with the same base scenario and seeing how the results are differing?
So because we weren't looking at sex differences here, we just controlled for that. We did control for participant sex in the MANOVA that we did here, and I think the only difference we found was for emotional support behavior, which is consistent with the previous research that women provide more emotional support in general than men. But I think it would be interesting I think that would be an interesting direction for future research as well, because these are different scenarios, right? So in this case, we were just striving for control, but men and women might be more or less likely to intervene depending on whether the victim is cross-sex or same-sex as well. And then you can add complexity with if the perpetrator is identifiable, what their sex is as well. It can get very complicated very fast. But if you eliminate some of these independent variables, you can focus on those instead. Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm curious, and I haven't thought this all the way through, so it might just be sort of off in left field, but I'm curious about what I would call the perception of events unfolding in real time. So if I get online and I see that my colleague Katie is online too, and then somebody posts something that's derogatory about her, let's say, it's hard to imagine, but and there I am, I'm there, I'm watching it happen, it's in real time, as opposed to, I've been in the airplane all day or working all day, and I just get on at the end of the day and I look and I see this exchange where somebody said something nasty about my friend, but several hours have passed.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if the perception, I don't know quite what to call
Yeah.
it, would drive diffusion of responsibility in the same way that number of bystanders.
Yeah, and in the early studies into the diffusion of responsibility, these were lab experiments, and they were actually calculating how many seconds it took someone to intervene, not just whether or not they intervened or not. So they were timing how quickly somebody would intervene and found those differences. But in this case, it's how long after the incident actually occurs, and that gets at a couple of things. First, that gets at the very definition of cyberbullying, because bullying is defined as something that happens repeatedly over time. Cyberbullying includes that component of the definition, but one incident can have repeated effects over time. So something can be posted once, but if it's still there 2 hours later, it's probably having repeated effects. Second, We asked people in the first study to recall how long it had been posted, but they were already recalling something that might have happened 7 months ago, so we didn't find anything for that data. But I think that it would further, I'm guessing here, that it would further diffuse their sense of personal responsibility if something mean had been posted now 6 hours. Oh, well, surely somebody has done something to reach out and help.
Somebody else maybe done something, but I look uncaring to mention it now. Why wasn't I on this earlier?
Absolutely, right? And now there's a general expectation that we're on all the time and that we see these things constantly, right? So I think that, yeah, that could further hinder our sense of personal responsibility to actually do something about it. Absolutely. Yeah.
But maybe also there's, as Matt alludes to, there's a performative nature, right? And so we know from the social support literature that it's important to be like, oh, I care, that's terrible,
Right.
popping in. And if you're worried about this audience of other people, like I want to absolutely make sure that my colleagues think that
Yeah.
I'm a caring, wonderful person. So I had better comment on it, but within the appropriate time frame to really
Sure.
get the full bang for my buck.
And that also gets at the previous question about, how else might we measure bystander intervention behaviors online. One other way to differentiate them is whether these behaviors are public or private, right? Do we choose to send them a private message or call them if we have their number because we're already close with them? Or are we posting something as a comment because we want to perform support behavior? And those are very different types of support as well. Public can be more powerful, but private in some cases can be more powerful and helpful too. Yeah.
Is active defense always a public thing?
No, it doesn't get at anything, the items don't get at anything related to whether or not it happened publicly or privately. So it could have happened either or. Yeah, so it was a very kind of blunt force instrument to get at behavior, just because it's an early study in this area, I think. Yeah.
Do we have other questions? Well, with that, I want to thank Brody for depressing but exciting.
Yeah, sorry for the, yeah. Thank you so much for having me here today.